simple, basic point which I've been thinking about quite a lot actually over the last several weeks as we have been under lockdown, which is that like everything else, there's a class dimension to the pandemic and to the experience of the pandemic. I don't, there have been these memes that have been floating about, that floated about earlier actually at an earlier stage, which, one of them was like that said that what was responsible for this was the passport, and what suffered is the Aadhaar card. Basically making the point that it's foreign travelers who brought it back, and the people who are suffering are the poor people, right? And of course, there's a factual sort of broad factual accuracy to this. It is true that the virus has come into our country through people who have traveled abroad, and that's not the poor people, by and large. But it's not just that. I think there's also a way in which one is to look at how the pandemic and the experience of the pandemic, not just people who are who test positive to the illness itself, to the virus itself, but the experience of the pandemic on large numbers of people, and how that changes our social equations, our ability to reproduce our own life on a daily basis, right? And to that, there is a huge class angle or a class divide, let's say. And this is, I'm not saying anything that's, out of the ordinary. It's actually something that should be quite self-evident. In other words, work from home is something that, people like us started doing. And it was possible for us to do because we had both things. We had work and we had a home, right? What about people who have neither work nor home, whose homes are 1,000 kilometers away, and whose work has now stopped because the employers who employed them are no longer in a position to employ them, or are not, paying their wages, etc., whatever. So then what about them? Now, if you saw the pictures that, emerged out of the massive reverse migration that happened of urban workers going back to rural areas or semi-urban areas, because they just wanted to get back home, because there was no clarity on what would happen in cities. They had no social cushion or a parachute that would kind of bail them out in some ways. So they really had no option. They had to go back home. How do you go back home? There are no trains, there are no buses, so you start walking, or you go on a bicycle, but most people start walking. Now, all of us have seen these images, right? We've seen them in Bombay, in Bangalore, in Delhi, all major cities. And what does the notion of social distancing then mean there? In those, it goes for a toss. It's impossible. It is impossible. In every major city, you would find that the poor people, forget about migrants. That's one part of the story. But even if you're not a migrant, even if you're a poor person living in a city, then the conditions of social life that you have, the conditions of familial life that you have also, the way in which your homes are structured, the way in which the relationship between the interior and the exterior is structured architecturally as well, and so on. All of that, it's to think about social distancing in that context is ridiculous. It's just, it makes no sense at all. A colleague of mine at Leftward Books had fever. And so, we were all very worried. He went to the hospital, and the hospital refused to test him, saying that, firstly, you're young, right? He's like 22 years old or something. So they said, you're young. So, and you only have fever. You have no other symptom. All right. So therefore, take these medicines, take some Crocin, Shosin and all that, go home. And then after 4 days, 5 days, if you still have fever, then come back. Hey, this is what happened to him at one of the top government hospitals in Delhi. Right now, he called me and he said, now what do I do? I said, well, you have nothing to do. You have to go back home, right? And so, let's assume that you have tested positive. We don't know what your situation is, but let's assume to be safe that you have actually tested positive. What would that mean? It would mean that you have to be isolated. Okay, quarantine, hard quarantine, not possible. At least some isolation has to happen. So, okay, you don't come to work, that's fine. Don't step out of your house, that's fine. In your house, try and be isolated. I said, where do you sleep? He said, I sleep on a bed. I said, how many beds are there at home? He said, two beds. How many people? Six people. So there are four brothers and parents. Six people, two beds. So the parents take one bed, two brothers take one bed, and two brothers sleep on the floor. So he used to sleep with one of his brothers on the bed. So I said, well, you can't be sleeping on the same bed as your brother. I mean, so he said, sir, what should I do? Where should I go? We have one room. Now, this is not uncommon. This is the experience of large numbers of lower middle class or poor people in urban situations. One room, six people. This is not uncommon at all. What does social distancing mean? Um, I stay in a place called Patel Nagar in New Delhi, and I work in Shadipur, which is right next door to us. So my walk to work is about a kilometer, and I walk through these tiny gullies, right? And even when the severe lockdown was on, when nothing was allowed, you were not supposed to even step out of the house, etc. I made two trips to go to my office for something that was urgent. I needed something, whatever it is. Twice I went to the office. Both times I saw that in the gullies, people were sitting outside in the gullies, and they were chatting and so on. Why? Because the houses are tiny. They are tiny. How can you remain in a 8 by 10 room for weeks on end? That's torture. That's literally like torture. You know, you can't do it. So therefore, you have to be out. You have to be in your gully. You have to sit on your steps. You have to, walk up and down something. You have to exercise in some way. What do you do? So I'm just saying that I think the experience of the pandemic, in terms of our social sort of interactions, in terms of what it does to our bodies as well, in terms of our bodily interactions with other people, in terms of how we relate to spaces around us, the spaces that we inhabit on a daily basis, our own house and the space right outside our house or right around our house, even if you're not going to work, all of this is deeply inflected by what your class position is. For somebody like me, it's possible for me to go to my terrace and exercise every morning. It's possible for my downstairs neighbor to bring their kid up to the terrace every evening and play with the kid. It's possible to do that. And when they are playing, then the rest of the people in the building don't use the terrace. It's possible for us to do that because we have the means. The poor, on the other hand, don't have these luxuries. So social distancing um, and the uh, and the experience of social distancing as it relates to our bodies, as it relates to the reproduction of our daily life, to the routines of our daily life, mean completely different things to people with means as opposed to people without means. I'm saying this very broadly. It's a very crude sort of a division to make: with means, without means. What does that mean? Is it not the case that there are very many, there's a range? Yes, I agree. There is a huge range of, even within the poor, broadly speaking, there's a huge range. Even within people with means, there's a huge range. Of course there is. But I think by and large, even if one thinks at this broad level of saying that there are people without means in our country, 80% of our population has no means, really, literally, Um, for them, the experience of the pandemic on their bodies and in their social reproduction of their daily lives is very different, I think, from what it means. And then, of course, there's the gender angle as well, which is to say that, there has been a lot of work on this, lots of articles have been written, lots of academic work is happening on this. What does the lockdown mean for women? Not just in terms of women who are in abusive relationships. That, of course, is one huge aspect, and domestic abuse, sexual abuse, etc., has gone up both for women and for children. That's one aspect of it. But even if, suppose there's no abuse, suppose everything is fine at that level, even there, it is true that, for instance, women's load of housework has increased, while, of course, they continue to work from home for whatever it is that they do, for a livelihood, teaching, or whatever it, you know. So, uh, so that is increased, but also the fact that women have lost their livelihoods in this period is also a reality. Because yesterday I was talking to somebody who was telling me how uh, they are doing statistical analysis of trying to figure out what the loss of livelihood has been in the pandemic period, and the percentages are just staggering. But what's really interesting is, of course, if you see in terms of absolute numbers, the number of men who have lost their jobs is, of course, much larger than the number of women who've lost their jobs. But that's also because, to begin with, there were many more men who had jobs as compared to how many women who had jobs, right? So there is that disbalance to begin with. But also, what this hides is the fact that if you look at the percentage change amongst men and amongst women, then it might be the case, they're still analyzing the data, etc., but it might be the case that in terms of a percentage drop, there's a larger drop for women who now don't have jobs as opposed to men, even though in absolute numbers, of course, it's much larger for men, and so on. So there are all of these aspects, and I'm saying that what the pandemic means for us in our social lives is very different, if depending on where in the on the class hierarchy you are.